The perfect day, shattered. Mona Lisa woke up with a flutter of excitement, a feeling she had dreamed of her entire life. Today was the day she would marry the man she loved, Obed. The sun filtered through her bedroom window, casting a warm glow on her white wedding dress hanging by the door. She stared at it, sparkling like a promise of a perfect future. Her heart swelled with anticipation. The town of Enso had been buzzing about the wedding for weeks. Streets were lined with colorful flowers, and every shop had put up banners congratulating the happy couple. Mona Lisa had always been the center of attention in her small town, but today was different. Today, she was the bride. The woman marrying the charming, kind, and handsome Obed. As she adjusted her veil, Mona Lisa's mother entered the room, tears of joy in her eyes. "You look like a princess, my dear," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Mama," Mona Lisa replied, her voice soft, but her heart pounding with excitement. Nothing could go wrong today. Everything was perfect, or at least, that's what she believed. As her father walked her down the aisle, Mona Lisa caught her first glimpse of Obed standing at the altar. He looked every bit as perfect as she had imagined. Tall, elegant, and smiling warmly at her. His dark tuxedo contrasted sharply with his bright smile, and Mona Lisa's heart fluttered as she took his hand. The ceremony unfolded like a dream. They exchanged vows, promising to love each other for the rest of their lives. But just as the priest was about to declare them husband and wife, the heavy wooden doors of the church swung open with a loud crash. Every head turned in unison. A man stood in the doorway, panting and visibly angry. His sharp features, strong build, and piercing eyes made him an intimidating figure. Mona Lisa had never seen him before, but something about the way he stared at Obed made her stomach twist. "Obed," the man shouted, his voice echoing through the church. "How could you do this to me?" Murmurs rippled through the congregation, and Mona Lisa's hand instinctively tightened around Obed's. She glanced up at him, hoping for reassurance, but his face had turned ghostly pale. He stood frozen, his eyes locked with the stranger's. "Who is that?" Mona Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Obed didn't answer. The man strode down the aisle, never taking his eyes off Obed. The guests looked on in shock as he approached the altar, his fists clenched in fury. "You promised me, Obed. You said you loved me." A collective gasp filled the room. Mona Lisa's heart stopped as the man's words sank in. Love? Promises? Her mind raced to make sense of what was happening. The stranger reached the altar and grabbed Obed by the collar, shaking him violently. "You can't marry her. You said we'd be together forever." Mona Lisa's head spun, her vision blurring. She turned to Obed, her heart pounding, begging him to explain. "Obed, what is going on?" But Obed remained silent, his eyes downcast, avoiding her gaze. The stranger released his grip, stepping back, his chest heaving with emotion. The room fell eerily quiet, every eye on the bride and groom. Finally, in a trembling voice, Obed spoke. "Mona Lisa, I have to tell you something." The stranger scoffed, crossing his arms. "Tell her the truth, Obed." Mona Lisa's throat tightened as she waited for the words that would shatter her world. She had dreamed of this moment her entire life, but never in her worst nightmares had she imagined this. Obed took a deep breath, his voice barely a whisper. "This is Lethando. He's my partner." The room felt like it was spinning, the air too thick to breathe. "Partner?" Mona Lisa stammered, her voice breaking. "What do you mean?" Obed's face was ashen, and he looked as though the weight of the world had collapsed onto his shoulders. "Lethando and I, we've been together for years. He's my partner, my lover." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating and heavy. Mona Lisa staggered back, clutching the altar for support. Her wedding day, the day she had envisioned for years, had just unraveled before her eyes. Tears welled up as she searched Obed's face for some hint of denial, for a reason to believe this wasn't real. But it was real. And there, standing before her, was the man she had thought she knew, confessing his love for another. "You lied to me," Mona Lisa choked out, her voice barely audible. "How could you?" Obed finally looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought if I married you, I could leave that part of my life behind. But I love him." Mona Lisa. Luthando, who had been standing silently, stepped closer. His anger had faded, replaced with sadness. "Obed and we thought we had something real. I couldn't just let him marry someone else." The weight of his words pressed down on Mona Lisa, making it hard to breathe. The perfect day, the dream wedding, had been an illusion, a mirage hiding the truth that had now come crashing down around her. Everything she thought she knew was gone, leaving her standing in the ruins of her perfect life. The crumbling illusion. The church was silent as the weight of Obed's confession settled over the room. Mona Lisa stood there, numb, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her mind struggled to process the scene before her, the love of her life, Obed, standing beside a man who had just declared his undying love for him. Everything she thought she knew about her future husband, her relationship, her wedding day, everything was crumbling like sand slipping through her fingers. Mona Lisa's knees buckled slightly as the shock coursed through her body. She steadied herself against the altar, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her wedding dress, the symbol of her perfect day, suddenly felt like a suffocating cage. The whispers from the congregation echoed in her ears, but they seemed distant, like they were happening in a different world. A world where she was just a spectator, watching her own life fall apart. Obed finally looked at her, guilt and shame etched deeply into his face. "Mona Lisa," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I never meant for this to happen." She stared at him, her mouth dry, her heart aching. "How long, Obed?" she managed to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How long have you been with him?" Obed swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Years," he said, his voice faltering. "We've been together for years, Mona Lisa, long before I met you." The truth hit her like a sledgehammer. All those moments she had cherished, the late-night talks, the plans for their future, the quiet moments of intimacy, they had all been built on a lie. She had been living in a fantasy, while the man she loved had been hiding a part of himself from her all along. Tears burned in the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Not in front of this stranger who had just barged into her life and torn it apart. Luthando stood a few feet away, his eyes still fixed on Obed, but there was no longer anger in his gaze, only sadness. He had interrupted this day, not out of spite, but out of love. A twisted, complicated love that had dragged all three of them into this nightmare. "I tried to stop him," Luthando said quietly, his voice surprisingly gentle now. "I told him not to go through with this wedding. I told him it wasn't fair to you, Mona Lisa. But he didn't listen. He thought he could live two lives, one with you and one with me. But love doesn't work like that." The truth of his words cut deep. Mona Lisa knew he was right. Love wasn't something you could divide or hide. Love required honesty, and Obed had failed her in the most fundamental way. Mona Lisa glanced at the guests, her friends, her family, each of them looking on with wide eyes and whispered disbelief. The room felt too small, too suffocating. She needed to get out. She needed to breathe. But she was trapped by the weight of everyone's expectations, the perfect wedding that had turned into a public spectacle of betrayal. Her mother, who had been sitting in the front row, finally stood up, her face a mask of shock and confusion. She took a step forward, as if to say something, but then hesitated, unsure of what words could possibly fix this. Mona Lisa didn't need fixing. She needed the truth. Turning back to Obed, she felt her voice harden. "So, what now, Obed? Was this your plan? Marry me, keep your secret, and continue living a lie? Or did you think this would magically fix everything?" Did you think you could just hide who you are? Obed flinched at her words, but there was no escaping the truth now. I didn't know what to do, he admitted, his voice trembling. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could love you both in different ways. I thought I could be the man you needed, and still be with him. Mona Lisa shook her head in disbelief. That's not love, Obed. That's cowardice. Luthando stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Obed's arm. You need to tell her everything, he urged softly. She deserves the truth. The truth. That's what Mona Lisa needed, but she wasn't sure she could handle it. Still, there was no going back now. She needed to hear everything, no matter how much it would hurt. Obed hesitated, glancing at Luthando for support, and then finally spoke. It started years ago, before I met you. Luthando and we met when I was living in the city. I was younger then, confused about who I was, what I wanted. Luthando was the first person who really understood me. We fell in love, but I was scared. Scared of what my family would think. Scared of what the world would say. So I left. I thought I could run from it, from who I am. That's when I met you, Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa felt a sickening twist in her stomach. She had always sensed a deep sadness in Obed, a restlessness he couldn't explain. But she had assumed it was just the weight of the world, the stress of life. She had never imagined that his sadness came from living a lie. I thought I could build a new life with you, Obed continued, his voice breaking. I thought I could bury that part of myself and be the man you needed. But Luthando found me. He never stopped loving me. And when he came back into my life, I couldn't walk away. Luthando looked at Mona Lisa, his expression one of quiet apology. I didn't want to hurt you, he said softly. But I couldn't let him marry you while pretending to be someone he's not. You deserve better than that. Mona Lisa's head spun. She had imagined so many possible outcomes for her life, so many futures with Obed by her side. But not this. Never this. How could she have been so blind? Her legs felt weak, and she sat down on the bench behind her, burying her face in her hands. The weight of it all was too much. The lies, the betrayal, the public humiliation. It was all too much. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft murmurs of the guests who were too shocked to know what to do. Mona Lisa's heart raced, and her mind swirled with 1,000 unanswered questions. Finally, she looked up, her eyes wet with tears she had tried to hold back. I need time, she whispered. I need space to think. Obed nodded, his face full of remorse. I understand, he said quietly. I'm so sorry, Mona Lisa. I never wanted this to happen. Luthando didn't say anything. He just stood there, his own guilt mingling with the pain of seeing the man he loved torn between two worlds. Mona Lisa stood up slowly, her legs shaky but determined. She needed to get out of this church, away from the weight of everyone's stares and expectations. She turned to leave, and as she did, she glanced back at Obed one last time. You've broken my heart, she said simply. And I don't know if it can ever be fixed. With that, she walked out of the church, leaving behind the shattered pieces of her wedding day and the man who had once promised her forever. The aftermath of a broken promise. Mona Lisa stepped out of the church into the harsh daylight, the cool breeze hitting her face like a slap of reality. The world outside was moving as though nothing had happened, as though her life hadn't just been torn apart. The town square was still decorated with flowers, the sun still shone brightly, and birds still chirped in the distance. Yet inside her, everything felt dark and broken. She had left Obed and Luthando inside, standing at the altar that should have symbolized the beginning of her new life. But there was no new life with Obed now, only questions, confusion, and heartbreak. She stumbled down the church steps, her wedding dress dragging along the pavement as if weighed down by her grief. The whispers of the guests inside the church seemed to follow her, their shock and pity hanging in the air like an oppressive cloud. Her mother hurried after her, her heels clicking against the pavement as she reached for her daughter. "Mona Lisa, wait. Let me drive you home," her mother said, her voice frantic with concern. But Mona Lisa shook her head. "No, Mama," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I need to be alone. I can't deal with anyone right now." Her mother's eyes were filled with tears of her own. She had dreamed of this day almost as much as Mona Lisa had. It was supposed to be a celebration, a union of two families. But now it was a tragedy, and no one knew what to say or do. With a soft sob, her mother nodded and let her go, watching helplessly as her daughter walked away from the church and into the unknown. Mona Lisa didn't know where she was going. Her feet carried her without thought, her mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded inside. She had dreamed of a perfect wedding day, but now she was walking through the streets of Amso, alone, in her wedding dress, the picture of a woman whose life had just fallen apart. She passed by the flower shop where she had picked out the roses for her bouquet, the bakery that had made the wedding cake. She saw people she knew, friends, acquaintances, but none of them dared approach her. They knew something had gone terribly wrong, and their eyes followed her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Finally, she found herself at the edge of town, near the small park where she and Obed used to take long walks together, planning their future. The memories stung now, like salt in an open wound. She walked over to the park bench where they had shared their first kiss, where they had laughed about silly things and talked about what their life together would look like. But now, all those dreams had been built on lies. Mona Lisa sat down heavily on the bench, her dress billowing around her like a cloud of shattered dreams. She buried her face in her hands and let out a sob that had been building inside her chest since the moment Lethendo had walked into the church. She cried for the loss of the man she thought she knew. She cried for the betrayal that had been hiding beneath the surface of their relationship, and she cried for the future she would never have. Time seemed to stand still as she sat there, her heart breaking over and over with each passing minute. The park was quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant laughter of children playing on the swings and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, and yet it did nothing to soothe the storm raging inside her. As she sat there, lost in her grief, she felt a presence beside her. Startled, she looked up to find her best friend, Amina, standing there, her eyes filled with concern. "Mona Lisa," Amina said softly, sitting down next to her on the bench. "I came as soon as I heard." Mona Lisa wiped at her eyes, her voice shaky. "I don't even know what to say, Amina. My whole life, everything I thought I knew, it's all a lie." Amina placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I can't imagine what you're going through, but you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you, whatever you need." Mona Lisa nodded, her heart aching with gratitude for her friend. But even Amina couldn't fix this. No one could. The pain of Obed's betrayal was too raw, too deep. She had trusted him with her heart, and he had shattered it. For a long time, the two friends sat in silence, the weight of what had happened hanging between them. Finally, Amina spoke again. "Mona Lisa, you deserve so much more than this. You deserve someone who loves you completely, who is honest with you from the start." Mona Lisa let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow in the quiet park. "I thought I had that. Amina, I thought Obed was that person, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." Amina squeezed her shoulder gently. "It's not your fault, Mona Lisa. You loved him with your whole heart. You trusted him, and he's the one who let you down." Mona Lisa's heart ached at her friend's words. She knew Amina was right, but that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. She had been blindsided, her future ripped away from her in an instant. "I don't know what to do," Mona Lisa admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how to move on from this." Amina leaned in closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You take it one step at a time. You don't have to figure it all out today. You just need to take care of yourself right now." Mona Lisa nodded, though she didn't feel much comfort. The path ahead felt dark and uncertain, and she wasn't sure how she would ever heal from this. Back at the church, Ob stood in front of the congregation, still reeling from Mona Lisa's exit. He had never imagined it would play out this way. But deep down, he knew it was his fault. He had made promises to both Mona Lisa and Lethando, promises he couldn't keep. Lethando stood beside him, silent and tense. The anger that had driven him to storm the wedding had dissipated, leaving only regret and sorrow. He had wanted Ob to come clean, but not like this. Not in such a public, painful way. "Ob," Lethando said quietly, "I didn't mean for this to happen." Ob shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "It's not your fault, Lethando. I should have been honest with her from the start. I should have told her the truth before any of this." The guests, still seated in stunned silence, began to murmur. Ob felt the weight of their judgment, their confusion. He had not only betrayed Mona Lisa, but he had also humiliated her in front of everyone they knew. Lethando placed a hand on his arm, his voice soft. "You need to go after her. You owe her that." Obed's heart twisted at the thought. He didn't know what he could possibly say to make things right. But he knew Lethando was right. He owed Mona Lisa an explanation, a real one. Taking a deep breath, Obed turned toward the door. As he left the church, the whispers of the crowd followed him, their eyes heavy with judgment. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was finding Mona Lisa and trying, if possible, to salvage something from the ruins of their relationship. Confronting the truth, Mona Lisa sat alone in her small, quiet apartment, the faint sound of the city buzzing beyond the window. It had been a week since the wedding, or rather, the day that was supposed to be her wedding. Time had passed in a blur, each day blending into the next as she struggled to process the enormity of what had happened. She hadn't spoken to Ode, and she hadn't been able to face her friends or family. The pain was too raw, too deep. The apartment felt cold and empty, a stark contrast to the warmth and love she had envisioned filling it once she and Ode started their life together. Now, the wedding dress that once symbolized joy and new beginnings was draped over a chair in the corner, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Mona Lisa hadn't even been able to bring herself to look at it. She had spent most of the week holed up in her apartment, replaying the events of that day over and over in her mind. She kept thinking about Obed's face when Lethando had stormed into the church, how his expression had shifted from love to guilt, how he had stood there, frozen, as the man he loved revealed the truth to everyone. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She didn't want to see anyone, but something told her that this conversation was long overdue. Reluctantly, she rose from the couch and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was Ode, looking more disheveled than she had ever seen him. His once neatly trimmed hair was unkempt, and his eyes were heavy with exhaustion and regret. "Mona Lisa," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Can we talk?" For a moment, she just stared at him, unsure of how to respond. She had been waiting for this, an explanation, a conversation. But now that he was here, she wasn't sure she could handle it. Still, she stepped aside and let him in. Ode walked into the apartment, his movements slow and cautious, as though he were entering a space that no longer belonged to him. He glanced around at the familiar surroundings, the home they had once planned to share together, now filled with the silence of what could have been. Mona Lisa crossed her arms, leaning against the wall as she watched him. "What do you want to say, Ode?" He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with the truth," she said coldly. "You owe me that much." Ode nodded, his face tightening as he prepared to finally lay everything bare. "You're right," he admitted. "I've owed you the truth for a long time." Mona Lisa's heart clenched, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. "I've known Lethando for years. We met when I was still figuring out who I was before I met you. We were in love, but I was terrified of what that meant. I was scared of what my family would think, scared of how the world would see me. So I left. I left him behind, and tried to bury that part of myself. Obed paused, his eyes searching Mona Lisa's face for any sign of understanding. But all he saw was the hurt and betrayal she had been carrying since that fateful day. He pressed on, knowing there was no turning back now. When I met you, I thought I could build a different kind of life. A life where I could be someone else, someone who fit the mold that everyone expected of me. You were everything I thought I needed. You were kind, beautiful, loving, but I was living a lie. I thought if I could just marry you, I could forget about Luthando. I thought I could make it work. Mona Lisa's eyes narrowed as she listened, her mind swimming with a mix of emotions. So you thought you could marry me, pretend to love me, and just keep him on the side. How could you even think that was okay? Obed's face crumpled with shame. I wasn't pretending to love you, Mona Lisa. I did love you. I do. But it wasn't the kind of love you deserve. It wasn't the whole truth. Mona Lisa felt a fresh wave of anger wash over her. So you thought you could love me and lie to me at the same time. Is that what love is to you? No, Obed whispered, his voice breaking. No, it's not. I was wrong. I was selfish, and I didn't think about how much I was hurting you. I was so focused on trying to make everyone happy, I didn't realize I was destroying everything in the process. The room fell silent as Mona Lisa stared at him, her emotions battling inside her. She had loved him deeply, but now she didn't even know who he was anymore. The man she had planned to marry had deceived her in the worst possible way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mona Lisa spoke. Do you even understand what you've done to me, Obed? You didn't just ruin our wedding. You ruined my trust in you, in us. I don't even know who I am anymore. I thought I was going to spend my life with you. I built my dreams around you. And now I'm left with nothing. Obed stepped closer, his eyes pleading. Mona Lisa, I never wanted to hurt you. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right. Mona Lisa let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Make things right? Obed, there's no making things right after what you did. You lied to me from the start. You used me to cover up your own fears, and now I'm the one left picking up the pieces. Obed's face fell, the weight of her words hitting him hard. I know, he said quietly. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to be honest with you now. I want to at least give you the truth, even if it's too late. Mona Lisa's eyes softened for a moment, but the hurt was still too fresh, too deep. She had waited for this conversation, but now that it was happening, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like the opening of an even deeper wound. You should have told me the truth from the beginning, she said softly. You should have trusted me enough to be honest with me. Instead, you let me fall in love with a lie. Obed's shoulders sagged, the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. I'm sorry, Mona Lisa. I really am. I never wanted this to happen. I thought I could be the man you needed, but I couldn't even be honest with myself. Mona Lisa turned away, her emotions overwhelming her. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. She didn't know if she could ever trust him again, but she knew that she couldn't live in this limbo any longer. I need time, she said finally. I need space to figure out what comes next. Obed nodded, though the pain in his eyes was clear. I understand. I'll give you whatever time you need. With that, he turned and left the apartment, leaving Mona Lisa standing alone once more. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, but there was also a sense of relief in the air. The truth was out, and now she could begin to pick up the pieces of her life, however shattered they may be. Rebuilding from the ashes. Days turned into weeks, and Mona Lisa found herself caught in a delicate balance between healing and heartache. After Obed left her apartment that day, she had fallen into a rhythm of solitude, trying to make sense of the shattered pieces of her life. The world outside seemed to carry on as usual. People went to work, children played in the streets, and the sun rose and set. But inside, Mona Lisa's world had been forever altered. Each morning, she woke up to an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The plans she had made for her future with Obed were gone, leaving her drifting in a sea of uncertainty. She had spent so long dreaming of a life with him, building her hopes around the idea of their shared future, that now, without him, she didn't know where to begin. But slowly, as the days passed, Mona Lisa realized something important. She still had herself. As much as her heart had been broken, she hadn't been destroyed. The love she had poured into Obed, the trust she had placed in their relationship, hadn't completely erased her. She was still standing, still breathing. And now she had to learn how to move forward on her own. She spent long hours walking around the town, revisiting places she had once gone with Obed. Restaurants, parks, cafes. Each place held a memory, a small piece of their life together, and at first, the pain of those memories was almost unbearable. But as she continued to confront them, something shifted. Instead of dwelling on the pain, Mona Lisa began to reclaim those spaces for herself. These weren't just places where she had loved and lost. They were places where she could start anew. On one of these walks, she found herself standing in front of the town library. It had always been a quiet, comforting place for her growing up, and she hadn't been there in years. On a whim, she stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old books and the quiet rustle of pages turning. There was something calming about the stillness, the way the outside world seemed to fall away once you entered. Mona Lisa wandered through the shelves aimlessly, letting her fingers trail along the spines of books she hadn't thought about in years. Then, in the corner of the room, she spotted a small table near the window, where sunlight streamed in, bathing the space in a warm glow. A young girl sat there, deeply engrossed in a book, her face lit up with concentration. Mona Lisa smiled to herself. She had always loved seeing people lost in stories, finding solace in worlds beyond their own. And in that moment, she realized that she had been so focused on her heartbreak that she had forgotten about the things that once brought her joy. Things that had nothing to do with Obed. Books had always been her escape, her refuge. And now, more than ever, she needed that escape. She picked a book off the shelf at random, something light and easy, and sat down at a nearby table. For the first time in weeks, she let herself get lost in the pages, in the words of someone else's story. And for a while, the pain eased. The world seemed a little less overwhelming. As the days passed, she returned to the library again and again, finding comfort in the routine of it. She would spend hours there, reading, writing in her journal, and slowly piecing herself back together. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts, where she didn't have to explain her pain to anyone. While Mona Lisa was finding her way through the rubble of her life, Obed was struggling with the weight of his choices. After leaving her apartment that day, he had moved back into the small flat he had shared with Luthando in the city. But things between them had been strained since the wedding. Luthando had been patient, but he wasn't blind to the tension that now existed between them. Obed had hurt not only Mona Lisa, but also Luthando. By trying to live two lives, he had betrayed the very person who had stood by him for years. And now, the consequences of his actions were catching up to him. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Luthando broke the silence. "Obed, we need to talk." Obed looked up from the book he had been pretending to read, guilt gnawing at him. "I know." Luthando's expression was serious, but not unkind. "This isn't working, Obed. Not like this." Obed felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything. I never meant for any of this to happen." Luthando leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I know you didn't, but that doesn't change the fact that you hurt both of us. You hurt Mona Lisa, and you hurt me. And the truth is, I don't know if we can go back to the way things were." Obed's heart sank. He had been clinging to the hope that somehow, after all of this, he could still have a future with Luthando. But deep down, he knew that hope was fading. "I love you, Luthando," Obed said, his voice filled with desperation. I don't want to lose you." Luthando's eyes softened, but his expression remained resolute. "I love you too, Obed. But love isn't enough. Not when there's no trust. Not when there's so much pain between us." Obed felt the weight of those words, like a stone settling in his chest. He had spent so long running from the truth, from his own fears, that now he was faced with the consequences of his cowardice. "What are you saying?" Obed asked, though he already knew the answer. Luthando sighed. His eyes filled with sadness. "I'm saying that maybe we need time apart. Time to figure out who we are without all of this mess. Maybe someday we can find our way back to each other. But right now, we both need space." Obed felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded. He couldn't argue with Luthando's logic. They both needed to heal, and staying together in the aftermath of everything that had happened was only prolonging the pain. "I understand," Obed whispered, his voice barely audible. Luthando reached across the table, taking Obed's hand in his. "I'll always care about you, Obed. But right now, you need to figure out who you are. And I need to do the same." Back in Manso, Mona Lisa continued to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She started volunteering at a local community center, helping children with their homework and organizing events for the elderly. It was something she had always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. Now it became a way for her to give back to the community that had supported her through her darkest days. She also reconnected with old friends, people she hadn't seen in years. Amina, of course, had been by her side since the beginning, but now Mona Lisa began to open up to others, slowly letting them back into her life. She realized that her world didn't have to revolve around Ode, or anyone else for that matter. She could build a life that was hers alone, a life filled with people who loved and supported her for who she was. One afternoon, while helping a group of children with a school project, Mona Lisa received a message on her phone. It was from Ode. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the text. "I know you don't want to see me, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly. I wish you all the happiness in the world. You deserve it." Mona Lisa stared at the message for a long moment, her emotions swirling. She didn't know if she would ever fully forgive Ode for what he had done, but she realized something important. She didn't need his apology to move on. She didn't need closure from him to rebuild her life. She typed a simple response. "Thank you. I wish you the same." And with that, she put the phone away, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't fully healed yet. There was still pain, still heartache. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Mona Lisa had lost her future with Ode, but in doing so, she had found herself. A new beginning. Months had passed since the day that should have been Mona Lisa's wedding, and though the scars of that day still lingered, she was no longer the broken woman who had walked out of the church in her wedding dress, devastated and lost. Life had a strange way of forcing growth through the cracks, and Mona Lisa had embraced the challenge of healing. She was no longer defined by Ode's betrayal. Now she was defined by her resilience, her strength, and her newfound sense of purpose. She had settled into a new routine, one that no longer revolved around anyone but herself. Her days were filled with meaningful work, volunteering at the community center, mentoring children, organizing events to help the elderly, and spending time with the friends who had been her rock through the toughest times. Slowly but surely, she was rebuilding her life on her own terms. But while she had focused on her outward life, there was still the matter of healing her heart, forgiving herself for the trust she had placed in Ode, for the dreams she had built around a man who wasn't what he seemed. Forgiving him had been a different story. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully forgive Ode, or if that was even necessary. What mattered more was that she was beginning to let go. It was a late autumn afternoon when everything seemed to change. Mona Lisa was at the community center, packing up supplies after an eventful day of helping children with a school project. The center had become her second home, a place where she felt like she was truly making a difference. She was laughing with a few of the kids when a familiar figure walked in. Amina, her best friend, smiling widely as she approached. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd come by," Amina said, giving Mona Lisa a warm hug. "You've been doing amazing things here." "Thanks," Mona Lisa replied, smiling at her friend. "It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it. These kids, they remind me why I love being here." Amina nodded, her expression softening. "You've come a long way, Mona. I'm so proud of you." Mona Lisa felt a lump in her throat at Amina's words. She had come a long way. She wasn't the same woman who had once pinned all her hopes and dreams on Obed and their future together. Now she was learning to find happiness within herself. As they continued talking, Amina's phone buzzed, and she glanced down at the screen. A look of hesitation crossed her face before she turned to Mona Lisa. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but Obed's been asking about you." Mona Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from Obed since the brief text exchange months ago. The message had been simple, a short apology, a wish for her happiness, and she had thought that was the end of it. But now, hearing his name again stirred something in her, though she wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness, or relief. "What does he want?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Amina hesitated. "I think he just wants to talk. He's been through a lot too, Mona. I'm not defending what he did, but he's been trying to figure himself out. He's asked me if you'd be willing to meet him." Mona Lisa felt a knot form in her stomach. The idea of seeing Obed again, face to face, brought back a flood of memories, some painful, some bittersweet. Part of her wanted to refuse. She didn't owe him anything. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger over the past months, was curious. She wanted closure, not for him, but for herself. She sighed deeply, her emotions swirling. "I don't know, Amina. I've moved on, or at least I'm trying to. What good could come from seeing him again?" Amina placed a gentle hand on Mona Lisa's arm. "Maybe it's not about what's good for him. Maybe it's about you finding peace with everything that happened. You deserve that, Mona." Mona Lisa knew Amina was right. This wasn't about reopening old wounds. It was about facing the past head-on and putting it to rest once and for all. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay, I'll meet him." A week later, Mona Lisa found herself standing outside the same park where she had once sat heartbroken, trying to make sense of her world after the wedding that never was. Now, the air was crisp, the leaves on the trees a vibrant mix of oranges, reds, and yellows, a reminder that change was inevitable. Nature moved forward, and so had she. Obed was already waiting at a bench near the edge of the park, his posture tense as he watched her approach. He looked different, more subdued, less polished than she remembered. There was a weariness in his eyes, a weight that hadn't been there before. It was strange, seeing him after all this time. For so long, he had been a central figure in her life, and now he felt like a stranger. "Mona Lisa," he said softly as she reached the bench. He stood awkwardly, unsure if he should hug her or not. She gave him a small nod, signaling that she was fine with just sitting. They both sat down in silence for a moment, neither one knowing quite how to begin. Mona Lisa could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't the overwhelming tension of their last encounter. This time, it was different, quieter, less charged with emotion. It was as if time had dulled the sharp edges of their pain, leaving only the dull ache of what had been lost. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," Obed finally said, breaking the silence. "I wasn't sure either," Mona Lisa replied honestly. "But I guess I needed to see you, to see if we could, I don't know, get some closure." Obed nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. I should have been honest with you from the start. I should have trusted you more." Mona Lisa studied his face, the sincerity in his eyes. She believed him. She could see that he had been struggling with his own guilt, just as she had been struggling with her heartbreak. But the difference was, she had found a way forward. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up, while Ob still seemed to be searching for his path. "I've forgiven you," she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. And she meant them. "But that doesn't mean things can go back to the way they were. We're different people now." Ob nodded, his expression a mix of relief and sadness. "I understand. I wanted to make things right. I wanted to tell you that I've been working on myself, trying to be more honest with who I am. I've started seeing a therapist, and I'm learning to accept that I don't need to hide anymore." Mona Lisa felt a pang of sympathy for him, but it was no longer tinged with the pain of betrayal. It was the compassion of someone who had moved beyond the hurt. "I'm glad you're finding your way, Ode. I really am. But I've also found my own way, and that way doesn't include you anymore." Ode lowered his head, accepting her words. "I figured as much. I wanted to thank you for the time we had. Even though it ended the way it did, you were still a big part of my life, Mona Lisa, and I'll always be grateful for that." Mona Lisa smiled softly, a sense of peace settling over her. "I'll always be grateful too, for the lessons I learned, for the strength I found. But it's time for both of us to move on." They sat in silence for a few moments longer, the weight of their past finally lifting. Mona Lisa stood up first, and Ob followed suit. They shared one final glance, a moment of quiet understanding, and then they parted ways, each walking in opposite directions through the park. As Mona Lisa walked away, the cool breeze brushed against her skin, but instead of feeling cold, she felt alive. The world felt open again, full of possibility. She had survived the storm, and now she was ready for whatever came next.